Hi everyone, my name's Foy Scalf. I work here at the Oriental Institute and I run the Research Archives Library here, and I'm also an Egyptologist, and I'd like to welcome you to our first from home Egyptology language seminar. This will be kicking off a series of weeks of seminars where various scholars who work here at the Oriental Institute will give you overviews of the various languages we study. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the ancient Egyptian language and the hieroglyphic writing system that's used to write, or at least one of the writing systems. So the first thing that we should begin thinking about is what's the goals for this short 30-minute or so seminar here. And what I'm trying to do is just give you a rough overview of Egyptian language and writing. We're not digging too deep. We're not trying to learn hieroglyphs in 30 minutes. This is just sort of an overview of what the language is like and the writing system is like, and some of the paths that you go down in studying it. So we'll be looking at basic fundamental frameworks, not learning hieroglyphs per se, but sort of looking at how the system works. Try to introduce you to sort of important and interesting tidbits as we go along, and maybe offer some new perspectives if you haven't looked too deeply into this material, and in certain cases provide you with hard to find information, which we're happy at the end of this, when you see this posted, feel free to comment on the OI social media channels and ask questions, and somebody from our team will definitely get in touch with you, or maybe I'll answer the questions myself if I see them as well. So feel free to get in touch with us about that. And we'll leave resources for learning more on those channels, on those social media channels. So the first thing to think about when we're talking about ancient Egyptian is the difference between the language itself and then the writing system. So language, on the one hand, is something that humans have as part of their biological endowment. You develop it naturally when you're born. You actually don't have to be taught it. You sort of learn it with stimulus and input from your parents and the people around you. And it has certain properties. You often think of language as being externalized through the spoken variety, through your voice, but you can also externalize language in a number of other ways, including things like sign language is an alternative way to externalize this symbolic system that we use for expressing our thoughts. On the other hand, writing is something that you have to learn, right? We all spend a lot of time as children usually learning how to read and write, and it's more painful for some of us than others. And basically the writing system is just this graphic system for representing the language as produced in human speech. And in this definition, I'm just adopting a very simple one that was used in our Visible Language Catalog, edited by our director, Christopher Woods, that you can download online from the OI website. So we'll be looking at both the Egyptian language and then the systems used to write it. Now, the ancient Egyptian language is usually put into this broader category that nowadays is often referred to as AFROASIATIC, meaning it has features that are associated with other languages like Semitic languages, so languages from Asia, that gives it the Asiatic part of that, as well as from Africa. So that's why it's often called Afroasiatic, and it used to be called this larger family Hamito-Semitic. So Egyptian forms its own branch of that larger Afroasiatic family. When we say its own branch, what we're really talking about is that Egyptians separated, so people living apart from these other language systems, developed this version, right? Their own language is the Egyptian language, so long ago that Egyptian is not directly related, at least in any of the historically attested varieties that we know, to these languages, but they all go back at some point to some kind of common ancestor if you trace it back far enough in history. So Egyptian has features of the Semitic languages, things like languages like Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, etc., but then also features of some of these African languages in the various families like Cushitic, Chadic, Berber, and Amadic. And this is actually to be expected when you think about Egypt's geographical location in the northeast corner of Africa with a land bridge to the Middle East. It makes sense that the Egyptian language would have features from all of these areas sort of combined together. So this is how it's generally categorized in terms of its linguistic family. It's part of this larger Afroasiatic family. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those features as we go on. Now, the language itself, most scholars divide it up into grammatical phases based on the different grammatical forms you find at different time periods. And so these numbers and these phases are very rough and in general arbitrary. Language changes, it develops continuously over time. So when you put these boundaries on any certain period or time, it's bound to be slightly artificial, but these give us decent categories to sort of work with, and they do represent some changes over time in the language. So the earliest Egyptian is written down around 3250 BC. We find that on these ivory tags from the site of Abydos. And then the other phases, Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Demotic, and Coptic. A lot of these are generally, again, just by convention, associated with periods. So Old Egyptian is often associated with the Egyptian Old Kingdom. Middle Egyptian is often associated with the Middle Kingdom. Late Egyptian with the New Kingdom. And then Demotic with the Saite period and later. And then Coptic often, although we'll talk about why it's complicated, associated with the Christian period in Egypt, starting in, let's say, the 4th century, roughly, AD. But again, those are just conventions. So scholars and academics have broken Egyptian up into these phases, basically to make it easier to study, so you can look at individual grammatical forms in a shorter time period rather than over the entire history of Egyptian, since it has such a long history. And we should also say that there are some dramatic changes in the grammar of the language over that time. Now, this chart shows you a very complicated view of how all these phases sort of interact with each other, or interwoven across history. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a chart like this is that just because we often associate, for example, Old Egyptian with the Old Kingdom, it doesn't mean that in later periods Old Egyptian disappears completely. What I mean is that, of course, in the sort of spoken language, the language is developing all the time. Old Egyptian develops over time into what we're calling Middle Egyptian. But what I mean is that Old Egyptian inscriptions, so texts written in Old Egyptian, continue to be copied throughout Egyptian history. So when you're learning Egyptian, depending on what time period and what type of text you're looking at, you could encounter grammatical features from any of these phases. So just to give you a couple of examples of that, here's an example on the left side of the screen. You're looking at copies of texts from the Pyramid of Unas, so from the late 5th dynasty. And on the right, you're looking at a papyrus that has those same spells copied out in hieratic from the Roman period, so the 1st or 2nd century AD. So over 2,000 years later, they're still writing out text in Old Egyptian, and this one in hieratic. Here's another example of that. In this example, they're copying out these pyramid texts into Demotic, again in a papyrus from the 1st or 2nd century AD, this time in Demotic rather than in hieratic. So you can encounter any of these phases in later periods of Egyptian history when you're dealing with their text, and it makes it fruitful, or you might say it inspires a lot of commentary from scholars who then debate about whether, for example, if you see Old Egyptian grammatical features in a text from a much later period of Egyptian history, does that mean that that text had been copied over all those centuries, or could this be scribes from a later period trying to imitate earlier phases of the language? And there's a lot of discussion in the secondary literature about these kinds of hypotheses. Now, the primary scripts that Egyptian language is written in is hieroglyphic, the most famous, hieratic, so a more cursive form, often used, not only often used, for example, writing in ink on papyrus, demotic, a slightly more cursive script that comes into use in the 8th century BC, and then Coptic, which we'll talk more about, but in terms of associating it with the Coptic Christian text, that becomes more popular in the 4th century AD. So we'll look at how some of these scripts are structured. And just to give you some examples, here is literary hieratic of the 12th dynasty. This just comes right out of Alan Gardner's very famous Egyptian grammar, which several generations of Egyptologists had learned from until more recent grammars were written, although I still highly recommend Gardner's grammar. It's still one of the best reference grammars we have, even if parts of it are outdated. So you can see at the top here the cursive hieratic forms and then a hieroglyphic transcription below. So below, Gardner has given you the hieroglyphic equivalents of these hieratic signs that are up above. The same in this case, but with New Kingdom. So rather than Middle Kingdom hieratic, New Kingdom hieratic, you can see there's, even if you don't recognize all the squiggles, when you look at this, you can tell that there's been some development. It's a little bit more cursive. In this particular official hieratic, you can see there's certain types of ligatures where the signs are connected together that you see that's sort of distinctive for this New Kingdom hieratic. And then a fairly early demotic text here showing you further that in demotic, the script is even more cursive, and it's more difficult to recognize the hieroglyphic equivalents of the demotic signs. So when you look at something like this, it may be much harder to recognize the hieroglyphs than even from the hieratic squiggles that you were previously looking at. And if you compare these together, you can see the sort of, again, this is just a rough approximation, but you can sort of get an idea of how the script from the top one, where some of the signs you can sort of recognize. You might recognize the crocodiles in the top line or human figures, and then when you get down to the bottom in the demotic, it's much more cursive and harder to recognize the original forms. To look at a couple of these, some of these, the demotic is not very far from the hieratic examples. So in this case, you're looking at the verb jed, which just means to say or speak. And in the hieratic, you can see in the middle, very similar to what you find in a lot of the demotic writings beneath it. However, other groups, like this group, para'a, the word for pharaoh, you can see in the hieratic looks somewhat similar to, pretty close to its hieroglyphic equivalents, but then when you look at the demotic, it's been quite changed and wouldn't necessarily be immediately recognizable if you didn't know what this word already was. So what this shows you is that in demotic, there's not, and in hieratic as well, but more so for demotic, there's less often a one-to-one correspondence between a demotic sign and a hieroglyphic equivalent. There's more ligatures, there's more independent development of the signs, and they're not always a one-to-one corresponding to some hieroglyphic equivalent. And we really probably shouldn't be thinking in those terms anyway, since demotic is, as a script, and hieratic even too, is sort of developing its own styles and features that we should keep in mind. Now, when scholars and academics and students study Egyptian inscriptions, they have a series of conventions that they typically use in publishing or editing text so that other people can understand what the person editing the text believe they're reading. So usually this is divided into a couple of different categories. So for example, here you're looking at a picture of the biography of Ahmose, son of Abana, a very famous text that discusses the battles against the Hyksos. And what scholars tend to do will be to transcribe the hieroglyphic characters into a sort of font, or nowadays we tend to use a font, but in previous generations they would draw these hieroglyphs out by hand so that you sort of had a generic version of the hieroglyphs, a little bit easier to read than the actual hieroglyphs that are written, let's say, on the wall in this case. Then those hieroglyphic characters, they are given a transliteration. And what the transliteration is converting those hieroglyphic characters into Roman characters that stand for the sound values of the hieroglyphs. So a lot of popular myths, often, people have the misinterpretation that hieroglyphs is still some kind of allegorical script. But the hieroglyphs stand for sounds, just like the letters in our Roman alphabet we use for English. The hieroglyphs largely stand for sounds, and so we give characters to those sounds, most of them, as you can see on the screen in the transliteration, familiar to you from the Roman alphabet, but then some other characters that have diacritics, like an H with a dot under it or an H with a flat line, etc., which stand for sounds that might not be common in our general scripts. And a lot of these characters were adopted over from scholars studying Semitic languages, back in the 1880s, at the sort of beginning of the real opening up of Egyptian language study. So you have this transcription into hieroglyphic characters, and I will say, when you read the word transcription, some people use it differently, but this is how we tend to use it. We have this transliteration into Roman characters standing for the sounds of those hieroglyphs so that you can break them up into words, and then we translate those. This is very common and is helpful for colleagues, students, and other scholars so that they can see what you're interpreting when you have read the text. If you go back to much earlier works, maybe they only give a transcription or only a translation, and it's harder to know in certain cases exactly how the editor understood the text. So this is really a convention that's supposed to help our colleagues interpret this material, because obviously sometimes Egyptian inscriptions can be quite difficult. Now, for the Egyptians, they referred to the hieroglyphic script as the words of God. So the Medu Necher, and so you can see here the transliteration on the left, and then in the middle I give you just this sort of rough way to sound it out. This does not reflect any actual pronunciation of Egyptian. As you'll see in a minute, the hieroglyphic script did not write vowels, so in general we don't really know all that much about what it sounds like. There's more details there, but for the most part we don't know exactly how the pronunciations sounded, but this will give you a rough version that you can use just to sound out these words. So the Medu Necher, literally this means the words of God. And you can see this on a very famous example in the Oriental Institute, the panel of Nefermat, where he says, Sut irer necheruef im sesh in sinef. He is the one who makes his gods in writing that cannot be erased. And this middle section, the three flags that you see in the hieroglyphic script, necheru here probably referring to the Medu Necher, the words of gods, or the divine things, the divine writing, the images that he's writing on his stela. And the reference at the end to writing that cannot be erased was a reference to this style that Nefermat and his wife Etet had in their tomb at Maidum, where they filled in cavities with this colored paste in their inscriptions. And a lot of the colored paste tended to fall out, so it actually didn't work as well as Nefermat probably intended, but you can see the results here in the panel. And so the Necheru probably refers to the Medu Necher, the words of God. So when you come to a place like a museum like the Oriental Institute or many of the other museums in America that have Egyptian collections, you can obviously see lots of examples of hieroglyphic script on stela like these from the Oriental Institute, the one of Uha on the left, and this third intermediate stela that we'll look more closely at in a few minutes on the right. Now, when you're looking at these stela and you want to know which direction that you're supposed to read the hieroglyphic script, the general rule is that you read into the face of the signs. So when you're looking at these texts and you see that the little bird signs, for example, are facing to the left, that means you start at the left. So the signs will face the beginning of the inscription. So in the top example, you would start on the left and read from left to right, but hieroglyphs can run both left to right and right to left. So in the second example, you see the signs are facing to the right, so you would start at the right and read to the left. And in general, when you read, whether it's right to left, left to right, you're then reading top to bottom. So notice the numbers along with the signs, so that they're basically going left to right, top to bottom, or right to left, top to bottom. And then the same thing when the hieroglyphs are used in vertical columns. You can see below on the left-hand side, the signs are facing to the left, so you're going to start at the left and work your way left to right, top to bottom. And on the bottom right, you're going to start at the top right and work your way right to left, top to bottom. So this is how you know where to begin to read a hieroglyphic inscription in general. There are exceptions to these rules, as there always are, but this is just some general ways that you can identify the direction that you need to read the hieroglyphic script. So here's a couple of other examples. Notice that the signs on the left-hand side of the screen are facing to the right. So you're going to start at the right, and then you're going to read top to bottom. So you can see the snake hieroglyph at the top is labeled number 1. That's where you start. And then you go to the little staff next to it, number 2. That actually reads Jed Medu, so recitation, or literally the saying of words. And then 3, this reed leaf sign. Number 4, the water ripple. That's a preposition, so recitation by, etc. And this is how you read the signs in this order. And so what you'll notice is that we'll talk about this in a minute, that the Egyptians write their words in groups, and you need to be able to recognize these groups in order to read hieroglyphic inscriptions. Now, we just said that when you're looking at a hieroglyphic text, you want to begin where the signs face. Well, in general, that's true, but there are exceptions, as I mentioned. And so what you see in this particular stela that we just showed a second ago of Jed Kansu EUS Ankh, notice that the hieroglyphs in the left 2 columns, okay, they face to the right. Okay, they face to the right. And then all of the other columns, the hieroglyphs face to the left. Now, you might think then that you need to read the 2 columns on the left, beginning at the right side, and read those 2 columns, and then read the other ones. However, you don't do that. You actually, in this case, start all the way at the left. That top group at the very upper left corner of the hieroglyphic inscription is a group that reads Hetepti Nisut, so an offering which the king gives, and then you have the name of the god, Ra Harakti, and then epithets of the god. But what the reason you know that we need to read this way is at the bottom of the second column, we see the start of the reference to the woman here on the stela, where it says in Osiris. You see the I hieroglyph at the bottom of the second column. That's the part of the writing of the name Osiris. And then it continues with her epithets, lady of the house, the noble woman, Jed Kansu EUS Ankh, etc., and then titles of her father. Now, what's going on here, just to explain why you have these exceptions, is if we go back and look, notice that the sun god on the left-hand side of the stela is facing to the right. So the hieroglyphs that are directly in front of him, that refer to him, right, his name Ra Harakti is in there, those are facing the same direction as this figure is facing. And likewise, Jed Kansu EUS Ankh's hieroglyphs that are above her head are facing in the direction she is facing. So what you see here is that the Egyptians tied in their hieroglyphic inscriptions very closely with their artistic representations in their images, so that often these hieroglyphic inscriptions reflected that. And in fact, if we go back, we saw this before. You may not have known when we first looked at it, but this biography of Ahmose, son of Abana, when you look at it, all the hieroglyphs are facing to the right, but we actually have to start reading this with the column all the way on the left. And in this case, scholars often refer to this as retrograde hieroglyphs. That is, you're reading the columns from left to right, top to bottom, but when you first look at the hieroglyphs, it looks like you're supposed to start at the right side. And probably the reason that this is being done is notice the hand holding the staff on the left side of the screen. Ahmose, a figure of him, is standing there facing to the right. So they wanted the inscription to start right in front of his face, but face to the right, the same direction that he's facing. And this probably helps to explain some of these retrograde inscriptions, is that they're tied into the direction of the other images that they are inscribed around. So even though we have some general rules about the directions in which you read hieroglyphs, those rules can be broken. And the Egyptians were also very creative, and they have text like this, which is basically a crossword puzzle that you can read left to right, right to left, and top to bottom. They're sort of playing with the hieroglyphic script in this case, but these are exceptions to the general rules. Now, in addition to the hieroglyphic script, you can see inscriptions in what we often refer to as cursive hieroglyphs. So basically, hieroglyphs that have been drawn in a slightly more cursive fashion than the hieroglyphic script, but not as cursive as hieratic. And you often see these in funerary texts, like on the left side, pyramid texts that were inscribed inside the lid of a coffin that's on display in the Oriental Institute. And then on the right side, a Book of the Dead papyrus that is also on display, at least parts of it, in the Oriental Institute Egyptian galleries. And hieratic, the more cursive version, so cursive hieroglyphs and then getting more cursive, the hieratic script, which obviously is maybe most famously written on papyri. In this case, an unusual set of papyri. Notice that the hieratic is written in columns on this papyrus. These are coffin texts written on this papyrus in the Oriental Institute, but more often you're going to see hieratic written in lines, right to left. Okay, they don't write it left to right. It's not like hieroglyphic. You can't go both ways in general. In hieratic, it always goes right to left, and they're going to be written in longer lines, and then those lines will be organized into columns, like you can see here on this Book of the Dead papyrus of Nes Shu Tefnut, which is also partially on display in the Oriental Institute. And this close-up just gives you a sort of idea of what these individual hieratic signs look like when you look at them closely. And of course, papyri is not the only material that they use hieratic on. They use it on also ostraca. And ostraca, this is a term that refers to either broken potsherds, like you see on the right, or pieces of limestone that were used as a writing surface. Particularly, these are common from the site of Deir el-Medina. And we should just note that the Egyptians wrote on any available surface. So none of this is supposed to be a comprehensive catalog. You can find writing on basically anything from ancient Egypt. These are just some of the common ones that you'll find. Now, more cursive than the hieratic, we have the Demotic script. Now, the Demotic script doesn't really come into use until the second half of the 8th century BC, and you find it initially mostly just for documentary texts, like the one that you see at the top, this papyrus in the Oriental Institute. That's a contract. And you see another early Demotic papyrus below it, this one, a letter to the god Thoth, which details some crimes that someone committed against the cult of the sacred Ibis. And Demotic is then used all the way down into the 5th century AD is when we get our last dated Demotic inscriptions. And like hieratic before it, and hieroglyphs for that matter, you can use Demotic on basically any available surface. So you have papyri like this, but also ostraca, these broken potsherds on the right, a tax receipt, and on the left, the copy of an oath that someone would take in a temple, usually about whether or not you stole items and things like that. Now, when it comes to the constituents, or how the signs that are used in the Egyptian system, it's probably easiest to start with the hieroglyphs, so you can sort of recognize some of the forms when we look at them. But there are different types of signs that are used to write out the words. And you can put these into basically two major classes. There are signs that stand for sounds, like we already talked about. We can call those phonograms. So they indicate the phonetic value, just like our letters. But then there are signs that stand for meaning or semantic values. And those kind of come in two flavors. Logograms, that is a sign that's used for a whole word. So for example, if you write the sign for the sun, like the sun that shines in the sky, you can use that as a logogram for the word for sun. And then lastly, what we call determinatives, or some scholars like to call them classifiers. These are signs that don't indicate any phonetic sound, but they indicate meaning that's associated with the word. So, for example, if you put the seated man that you see on the screen after a word, that determines it or classifies it as something that has to do with, let's say, humankind or mankind or men or professions, etc. And so these determinatives act as a way to limit the meaning of the phonetic signs that come in front of it. And notice that for Egyptian, they don't write the vowels. All of their signs either stand for consonants or are these determinatives. Now, when we're talking about the phonograms, so the signs that stand for sounds, you can break those up into other groups. For example, signs that stand for a single consonant only, Sometimes you'll see this referred to as the Egyptian alphabet. This is a group of signs that stand for just a single consonant, but then there are signs that stand for multiple consonants, so signs that stand for 2 consonants, biliteral, triliteral, etc. Or we have these signs that just stand for the whole word, the logograms, and as we said, the determinatives. So this is from Gardner's Grammar on the left. You can see the list of the quote-unquote alphabetic signs. And the reason I put alphabet here in quotes is because the Egyptians never really used the signs as a true alphabet, and so that could be a little bit misleading. So the way to really think about these are the hieroglyphs in the system that stood for a single consonantal sound. And then you can see those on the screen with the characters that we give in the transliteration for the sounds that they stood for. So the human foot stood for a B sound, the little square stool stood for a P sound, the horned viper an F sound, etc. So you have these single consonant signs that you can use to help write Egyptian words. Then you also have signs that stand for more than one consonant. And so the first one you see in the upper left, this pillar, the werebird next to it. Next to that, the neb basket. So notice that the little basket, it stands for the sounds N and B together, right? Or the bird, it stands for the W and R sounds together. These are biliteral signs. They stand for 2 consonantal sounds together. And as we mentioned, there were the triliteral signs. Here's just some charts showing you how those work, just to give you a rough idea of how the system is put together. You have these different types of signs, and each word is written using a combination of those signs. So this maybe simplest way to write words in Egyptian is you can use logograms. So you can use the picture of the item for that item. So for example, upper left, you see an image of a heart, and you can use that. These logograms are often, but not always, used with the stroke. So the stroke underneath it is sort of just to tell you, hey, this is a logogram. So the heart here, and you would read yib, the Egyptian word for heart. Underneath that, the arm, you would just read ah, the Egyptian word for arm, the house sign, pair for house, and etc. So you can just use the sign, the picture of the item, to write that word, and you would read it with the appropriate phonetic values of that word. All right. And then you would usually group those phonetic characters with some type of determinative. And it depends on the word type. More common words, prepositions, things like that often don't have determinatives, certain verbs. And then other words tend to more likely. It also depends on which period and which type of text you're looking at. But often Egyptian words had determinatives or classifiers. So for example, you can see in the top row, the seated man. You want to write the word for man. You use the bolt sign. So if we go back to our single consonantal signs and you look down the left, about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see that there's a door bolt sign that stands for the sound S, so the S sound. And we use that followed by this determinative of a seated man in the stroke, and that's how they write the word for man. Same way with the next determinative, the seated god with a beard. You put it after the name for the god. So here we have 3 uniconsonantal signs or uniliteral signs, the S, K, and the R, and that writes out the god's name Sokar, and you put the god after it to tell you that it's a divine name. So these are how these signs are put together to write Egyptian words, and there's long lists of determinatives and classifiers. This is just a small section of them just to give you some ideas of what you can see, but there's many of these signs in the Egyptian system. Now the Egyptians, when they learned Egyptians in sort of their scribal schools, when they learned to write, and a good way to do it for us is learning the words as a group. So the Egyptians used group writing. That is, there can be a lot of variation in the writing of individual Egyptian words and the signs that are used. So what the Egyptians can do is they can use various combinations of uniliteral signs, biliteral signs, triliteral signs, determinatives, and logograms to write individual words. So for example, here on the upper left you have the word Ankh, the word for life. It's written with one sign that's triliteral, so that gives you all three consonants, and then it's grouped with these next two signs, which give you what we call phonetic complements. So the little squiggly water ripple sign at the top stands for the sound in, and then the sign underneath it stands for what we often call third H, or the sound in your when you say ankh. And that's just telling you, it's reinforcing the reading of ankh. You don't read these as second or duplicative phonetic sounds. It's reinforcing the three consonants that the ankh stands for. Same thing with this next group, nefer, the word for good or perfect or beautiful. The first sign, it stands as a triliteral sign, stands for NFR all by itself, and then these phonetic complements reinforce this reading. So you learn Egyptian words in these groups, and that's how the writing system really works, because if you get too married to a particular group for a particular word, you will get a lot of surprises, because different scribes wrote words with different groups in each text. And so the way that you sort of learn the vocabulary is knowing the consonantal structure of the words and then being flexible with the types of signs that could go into writing those consonantal structures. And one of the reasons you have to be flexible is because any of these hieroglyphic characters that you find in the writing system can be used in any of the categories of signs that we've talked about. So meaning any sign could be in a particular writing, a logogram, or it could be a phonogram, or it could be a determinative. So this is what you see on the screen here. At the top, you see the word for mountain written as a logogram. So you just see this, these two hills with the valley in between. It's a picture of a mountain that you would see on the horizon, and you can use that as a logogram just to write the word Jew for mountain, right? So that's the logogram. But with the rebus principle, this is how the sort of magic of writing systems and how the Egyptians and other writing systems developed, is once you have a picture of an item and the sound that goes with that picture, then you can use that picture to write that sound value in any other word. So for example, if you take the sign of the mountain that you see at the top as the logogram, and then you use it with a different determinative. So notice that in the second example, you have the mountain sign, this little quail chick bird sign, and then a much smaller bird that we often call the bad bird or the evil bird, usually is a determinative for words that have a negative connotation. Here, this word Jew, the mountain, is just a phonogram. It's just giving you that underlying D and W phonetic sound, and that's a word that means evil. So when you look at this here, the mountain is just a phonogram. Same thing with the next example, the writing of Abju, which is the name of a city, Abydos, a very famous and important religious city in ancient Egypt. Here it's just standing for that same sound in Abju. That second half of the word is being written with the phonetics of that sign. And then finally, notice the last example where the mountain sign has no phonetic value. It's just a determinative in this word chabet, which is the name of a mountain from funerary text. So you can see that any particular sign is not limited to one of these groups. It can be used in any of these capacities depending on the word that it's being used in. So this is why learning hieroglyphs requires some flexibility when you're looking at the writing of the words, because you'll see a lot of variation from one text to another, from one scribe to another, one period to another in the writings of individual words. And so what you do is you learn to read the groups, right? So you have, for example, at the top here, a triliteral hieroglyph standing for the three consonants Heper. It's just the beetle. And you could use that to write a word for beetle as a determinative, so Keprer, the beetle, or in group writing, so here with the phonetic complements as the verb to become. And you see a few more examples here, the logogram pair for house, then you use it as the phonetic sign in the verb for to go forth. And this is how all of the Egyptian system really works. Here what you see, ways to distinguish words that have the same phonetic sounds. So at the top you see wab, a verb that means to be pure, and then you put a person, the little seated man, after it, and now it means wab, a purification priest. Okay, right? Because now it's the concept of being pure, but within the category of human beings. And so this is a purification priest. Likewise, rim has the same phonetic sounds in between two words. One word is the word for a fish, so you put the fish determinative after it. And another word is rim, to weep, so the verb to cry. And in this case, you put a crying eye after it rather than the fish. So you can see that you use a combination of sound characters or phonograms in combination with the meaning characters or semantic characters like the determinatives and classifiers to form the Egyptian words. And then you learn those as a group. So it's not that you just know that rim means fish, and you have to guess that from context. They'll help you by using these determinatives, tell you the characters coming right before the fish sign have something to do with a name of a fish or a type of fish, or fish in general, etc. So when you end up studying Egyptian and trying to read Egyptian text, you end up having to develop the skill of breaking the text up into its constituent parts. So what you're looking at here is an inscription from a stela, and I've just drawn lines in between the individual words so that you can see where you have to break up the hieroglyphic text, because of course hieroglyphs are what you might call scriptio continua. That is, they're not written with punctuation and space in between the words. You have to recognize that from knowing the groups that make up the individual vocabulary items. So as you study hieroglyphs, you develop the skill to be able to break up these individual words so you know where words stop and start. And the Egyptians, the writing system actually really helps you, because the determinatives typically come at the end of words, and they almost act as word dividers to a certain extent, helping you break up where to read individual words. Now, you might think this kind of group writing sounds difficult and foreign and complicated, but the fact is we're using it all the time. You see something like this, where you have I, typical Roman character, and then you use logograms, right? The sign of a heart to mean to love, and the sign of a phone to mean texting, so you could write I love texting. Or something like this, where you use this same rebus principle. So you have the I again just to stand for the pronoun in English, but then you combine the letter H with the number 8, and you're using the number 8 here for the sound that it makes, not because you want the number 8, but you want that sound of 8, so that I hate, and then you use the letter U for the sound of its name to spell out the pronoun you, so I hate you. This is the same type of rebus principle that's being used in the Egyptian hieroglyphs when you have something like this, where you have a logogram, right, a picture that has a sound, so Jew for mountain, and then you use that picture wherever else you need that sound value. That's exactly the same thing that's going on in these kind of examples, where you're using the letter U for the sound of its name, or the number 8 for the sound of its name, to write out these sounds. It's the same principle that's at work. So we're sort of doing it all the time. It just seems more foreign in hieroglyphics because we're not as used to that system, and we're not growing up with the Egyptian language as our native language. Now, because of the way that the hieroglyphic system works with the consonantal skeleton of words, is scribes can play with the system. And so this is a completely made up sentence. You probably would never see it in Egyptian, but it's just to sort of give you an example of how this could work, where you have the same root 4 different times, sesh, sesh, seshu, sesh, to mean may the scribe write the writings of the document. And you can see the little scribal kit hieroglyph that's used multiple times. And the individual words are distinguished by the determinatives that follow them. So notice that the verb to write at the beginning has a little rolled up papyrus scroll as a determinative. The word for scribe has the seated man. The words for writings has these 3 strokes, which tells you it's plural. And then at the end you have the little tie that tells you we're talking about a written document. Now again, this is a completely made up example, but it's just to show you that the Egyptians can be very creative and sort of play around with these writings. And if you want to see some of the most extreme cases of that, you can see that from these inscriptions at the Temple of Esna, just inside the main section that's preserved of the temple today. And what you see here are the inscription on the left, written entirely in hieroglyphs of rams, and the inscription on the right, written entirely in hieroglyphs of crocodiles. And this is the most sort of extreme version of this, where the priestly scribes who were writing these texts were really sort of playing around with the nature of the script in very sort of fun, scholarly, artistic ways. And these have been read. There's been an attempt at interpreting these inscriptions, these all crocodile or all ram inscriptions. So it's not just an artistic convention. Now, when we're talking about beyond the writing system, and when we're looking at these sort of sportive examples, as I sort of gave you before, when you're talking about having the same root repeated, but with the words meaning slightly different things, what this shows us is how the Egyptian lexicon is organized around consonantal roots. In that way, it's very similar to a lot of Semitic languages. It has a consonantal root structure, and those consonants provide you the lexical meanings of the words. When I say lexical meaning, I mean like the dictionary meaning. It comes from the consonants, and the vowels give you the different grammatical forms. So a nice way to show you this is maybe to offer an example from Akkadian. So for example, you have the root, the consonantal root PRS. Everywhere you see that root, it's going to have some meaning related to cut off or to divide or to judge, something like that. And you can see in the little chart that I show you here, it's the vowels that you insert between the consonants that gives you the different grammatical forms. So parasum for the infinitive, ipris for the past tense, iparas for the present, puris from the imperative, and parisum for the participle. And the Egyptian system worked on a similar consonantal root system, so that the consonants often, although not always, because remember Egyptian is sort of partially Semitic and partially similar to these African languages, but they often, the lexical meaning is determined by these consonantal root structures. So for example, I give you just one example, the word hesbet for regnal year, which comes from, is a derivative of the verb heseb, to count, and you can still see this root in modern Arabic today, from hasaba, to count, or hisab, the word for check. So here are a couple of examples of how this might work in Egyptian. The top example, you have a root that just has two consonants in its structure, jed, so the underlined D and the D. And it can be used in a variety of forms, right, in the infinitive or the past tense of the participle, etc. But notice that you can also have in Egyptian a root with the same sounds, but a different meaning. So the root that's written at the top, notice it's just the two hieroglyphic signs. Jed means to say or to speak. The root at the bottom, where you see the two hieroglyphic signs followed by the jed pillar determinative or biliteral sign, and then the book roll determinative, this means to endure or to be stable. So notice here what's nice about the hieroglyphic writing system is that it allows you to distinguish between roots that have the same sound, right? Synonymous roots. It will allow you to distinguish between them using these determinatives. So when you see this jed pillar after the initial consonantal signs in the second example, it helps to tell you the meaning of that word. And like we saw with the rebus principle, you might at first look at this consonantal structure and think that it's maybe unusual if you haven't encountered it before. But notice that we're already doing this in some ways, even in English. So for example, we have roots like sing, sang, sung, right? But then we also have similar consonantal roots like singe and singed, or snag and snagged, or snug and snugged. Those all have the same consonantal consonants involved in each of them, but different meanings. So, but notice like sing, sang, sung, it's the vowels that give you the different grammatical forms, okay? just like the Egyptian or in the Semitic system that we saw before. So you're actually already doing this on a daily basis when you're talking and just not really noticing it. Now, of course, the English, I don't want to imply that it has a consonantal root system like Semitic or Egyptian. I'm just giving you examples to show you how the combination of vowels and consonants give you both meaning, but then also lexical meaning, but then also grammatical forms. And what's nice about something like the Egyptian hieroglyphic writing system, that it's useful over a alphabetic system, right? In past, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it may have been common for certain scholars to claim superiority for an alphabetic script. Well, one thing that's hard to do in an alphabetic script is distinguish between these meanings. So, for example, with the word bit, you could say a little bit to mean a small amount. You could say 8 bits in a byte, talking about, computer bytes, or a horse's bit, this thing that a horse holds in its mouth. And from the writing itself, right, from the characters on the screen, you can't tell which means which. You have to get that from context. Whereas with a hieroglyphic writing system, they can actually distinguish these words from each other using these determinatives. So, for example, wab, to be pure, that we saw before, wab with the little seated hieroglyph after it for a priest, wabet with the house determinative for a purification room, or wabu, and then a cloth determinative for the clothing for divine statues. So in some ways, the hieroglyphic writing system is actually quite useful because you can distinguish between these words that in an alphabetic system would be more difficult to distinguish. Now, with that said, when we get to Coptic, so for the sake of this discussion, let's say 4th century and later, Coptic adopts the Greek alphabet to write the Egyptian language, and then they supplement that Greek alphabet with a number of characters, depending on the Coptic dialect, that stand for sounds for which the Greek didn't have a readily available symbol. So they actually take over signs from Demotic and combine it together with the Greek alphabet to write out Coptic. So Coptic is just the ancient Egyptian language, but now written in a script that's mostly the Greek alphabet with this small set of supplementary signs for sounds that weren't typical in the Greek alphabet. Now, when we talk about Coptic, sometimes it gets confused. On the one hand, it refers to Egyptian Christians, and on the other hand, it refers to the language and script used to write Coptic language, and we're talking about ancient Egyptian language. And we get this word Copt from Arabic, al-Qibt, and its derivatives. But what you might not realize is that this word Coptic is related directly to our word for Egypt. They actually both come ultimately from the same place. So when you're looking at like the Greek word Egyptos, you can see how these, again, the consonants, so CPT in Coptic or GPT in Egypt, come from the same word. And it's thought that this, like Egyptos, derives from the name of a temple in Memphis, the Hut Ka Ptah, the temple of the spirit of Ptah in the city of Memphis. And you can see how the consonantal structure of that has been passed over the centuries. So you can see the K in the original Egyptian name goes to the G in the Greek, and now to our modern C in Coptic, the P from Ptah, the T from Ptah, also P and T in Egypt, and also the P and T in Coptic. So these are actually all related to a name for Egypt. But when we're using Coptic to refer to the language, we're talking about the last phase of the ancient Egyptian language. And notice with Demotic and Coptic, the word refers to both the script and the language phase. So when we talk about Demotic, we're talking about both a script or a language, and Coptic, both a script or a language at the same time. So when we're talking about Coptic in terms of the language phase, the last phase of ancient Egyptian, which, by the way, is still used as the liturgical language in the Coptic Church, and also among revival communities who are trying to revive Coptic as an everyday language. Now in Coptic, they referred to Egyptians as Rimenkema, so the people of Egypt. You can see the hieroglyphic version of that on the upper right. And then the language as Mint Rimenkema, or literally the words of people of Egypt. And so you can see that on the second example here. This is how they referred to the Egyptian language: Mint Rimenkema, older hieroglyphic Medet Rimechen Kemet. They adopted the Greek alphabet, supplemented with these signs from Demotic for sounds that the Greek alphabet didn't cover. And here are some Coptic texts from the Oriental Institute. On the right, a liturgical book that's lost its binding, and then on the left, a magical manuscript on paper to cause impotence that we've talked about in a recent podcast. And here are a couple of Coptic ostraca that appeared in the Visible Language exhibit that I mentioned earlier. Now, what's really interesting about, if you look at late Demotic, so let's say 2nd, 3rd century AD Demotic, and early Coptic, so 3rd, 4th century AD Coptic, they're essentially the same language underneath them, right? That is, there's Egyptians speaking Egyptian in, let's say, 300 AD Egypt. And in certain contexts, you might write out that Egyptian language in Demotic, and in other contexts, you might write that out in Coptic script. And in fact, those are so closely related that in certain cases, if you look back at earlier scholarship, so this from the catalog of papyri in the John Rylands Library, you can see that the Demotic at the top was actually transcribed out into Coptic letters in the center here to sort of show you the pronunciation and structure of the language. And for late Demotic, the relationship is so close to early Coptic, you can actually do that and start to get an idea of what the language sounded like, a quite close idea, because of course once they adopt the Greek alphabet for Coptic, they start writing out vowels. Now, unfortunately, you can't just take that and apply it backwards to, let's say, Middle Egyptian, because the constructions of the grammar are so different. They've changed so much that they don't apply directly. You can still use it to get an idea, a shape, but you can't apply it directly because most of the verbal system, for example, is very, very different between Middle Egyptian and Coptic. The other interesting aspect of this experiment, or about this transition, is that the Egyptians actually for several centuries had made, at least occasionally, experimental writings using the Greek alphabet to write Egyptian. So for example, here you see an inscription from a temple at Abydos. When you look at it, it looks like Greek characters, but when you try to read it, you find out that it's actually in Egyptian. And this goes all the way back to the late 3rd century BC, one of these rebel pharaohs, native rebel pharaoh against the Ptolemies. And someone went into this temple and wrote this, scratched this into a wall, Greek characters, but to write out the sounds of Egyptian. And we have other examples here. Papyrus from the British Museum that has magical spells written out, again, in a Greek script, or what you should really be called, most people call this Old Coptic, right? So it's an experiment using the Greek script supplemented with those signs from Demotic to write out the sounds of Egyptian. And these can be very difficult, again, without the determinatives and their typical hieroglyphic writings. They can be much more difficult to interpret these texts. And we see this also in the Greco-Demotic magical papyri, where individual words written out in Demotic, particularly like magical names, would be transcribed. You can see on the right in the hand copy, certain words have the Old Coptic version, right? So where they're trying to write out the pronunciation of those magic names above the Demotic version. So these are all experiments in writing the Egyptian language with an alphabetic script, in this case the Greek alphabetic script supplemented with these other characters from Demotic. And we have some fascinating examples of this from a site called Medinat Mahdi, where you can really tell how experimental the scribes are being. In these cases, you have hieroglyphic script, hieratic script, Demotic, and Greek all being used simultaneously, and you can see in the center example they're actually switching back and forth for different words. So you can see in the second line there's a Greek word written in between demotic signs. So this is a really interesting sort of perspective on the multicultural nature of Egypt in, let's say, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD. In some of these old Coptic texts like this Astrakhan 2, you can see that the script hasn't yet become standardized. So a lot of times people will use Old Coptic for any of these early experiments and the unstandardized Coptic script up until about the 4th century, where you start to get a more standardized version and you get a lot of your the beginnings of your biblical text written out in Coptic. So you have cases like this where the script hasn't been standardized, and you can also see cases like this letter that is bilingual. So it has sections of it written in Greek, sections of it written in Coptic. So again, you can see this sort of multicultural nature of Egyptian society during these periods. And with the adoption of the Greek alphabet, and particularly with the translation of scriptures into Coptic, you had a lot of borrowing, and particularly in those literary texts, of Greek vocabulary items. So you have this sort of distinguishing between Old Coptic, these earlier experiments, and then sort of formal Coptic, so the use for the production of these literary texts, in particular biblical texts that you see. And there's a number of dialects, more than that's on the screen. These are just some of the main examples that have been identified. And I should also say the sort of letters on the map are just sort of rough. You can't necessarily define the dialects geographically in this exact way, but you can identify in the Coptic different dialects based on different spellings and pronunciations of words, something that's very difficult for earlier phases of Egyptian. In earlier phases, we can be quite confident that there were different dialects. We have references to it in text, but distinguishing them in the hieroglyphic characters is much more difficult. So this is sort of the writing system and the basics of the language, and I just wanted to give you a very little bit of a taste of what the Egyptian verbal system sort of looks like, because a lot of folks often think that when you study Egyptian, it's sort of not like studying other languages, but of course it has grammar just like other languages. And in fact, most people are a bit disappointed when they start learning Egyptian and learning hieroglyphs that actually you have to learn a lot of grammar. And so you end up learning your English grammar all over again when you're learning Egyptian. So for Egyptian, especially the earlier phases, so in Middle Egyptian or earlier, there's a lot of debate about sort of the nature of the system and how many verbal forms there are. But in general, we refer to these forms as the Sejamef forms, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But what you should know is that many Egyptologists disagree on this, and each Egyptologist tends to have sort of their own understanding and interpretation of this with their own idiosyncrasies between them. Now, for Middle Egyptian and earlier, okay, so again, that sort of Middle Kingdom period and earlier, there's a pattern where you take the root of a verb and combine it with a pronoun, a suffix pronoun, so they're attached together, they're bound. And so this is often in Egyptian called the suffix conjugation, which might be confusing because the suffix conjugation in Semitic often means something else, a form that we call the stative in Egyptian. But we often call this the suffix conjugation because they use suffix pronouns directly bound to the root or the stem of the verb to produce the verbal form. And so that's what you see at the bottom there. This is the root sejam, which just means to hear, and then the little horned viper is the pronoun, so that's the F sound. So that's why we call it the sejam F, because this root sejam was used by a number of Egyptologists for many years as sort of the paradigmatic example, right? It's a strong verb. You have 3 strong consonants in it, and they use it as the paradigmatic verb. So we often call these the Sejam F forms, and depending on who you are, you may believe in one or more of these forms in the system. But the way that this early verbal system worked, and again, not for all the verb forms, but for these Sejam F forms, is you just use suffixes at the end to indicate the different number or person who's doing the action. So for example, sejamef, the F is the pronoun for third masculine singular, so it would mean something like, may he hear, or may he listen. Now you can add other suffixes to indicate other things, and in particular, the suffix in. If you add that after the verbal base and then follow that with your pronoun, you'll get a form we call the sejam inef, which in general you can think of as the Egyptian past tense. That's a bit of a misnomer, but for the sake of just getting an idea about it, you can think of it as the past tense. So you take the verbal base, you combine it with this morpheme, that's sort of the perfect morpheme or the past tense morpheme, and then your suffix to get the past tense. So sejaminef, he has heard, or he heard, and usually this form is used with a particle in front of it, so a little element in language that you combine with the verbal form. So here, for example, are some of those particles. You see at the top, the first example in hieroglyphs, sejaminef, so no particle, and then EU sejaminef, he heard, or aha in sejaminef. These are typical constructions in Middle Egyptian literary text where you find this sejaminef verbal form combined with these particles to write various sentences and other constructions. Now the sejam inef, it gets complicated, and we're not going to get into all those complications because it depends if you think there are more than one sejam inef form, but we do have examples of some sejam inef forms written out in cuneiform documents that gives us a rough approximation of how these forms may have been pronounced, or at least the sort of vocalic structure. So we have setep inra. This is an epithet found most particularly in the late 18th dynasty, 19th and 20th dynasties, particularly with the Ramessid kings. That's where you see it most famously. And this epithet setep inra, it literally means the one whom Re, the sun god, has chosen. And we have a couple of examples written out in cuneiform where it's spelled out Sha Te Ep Na Ri A, which probably stood for, at least in a slightly earlier pronunciation, something like Satip Naria. Okay, and again, this is sort of rough, and you have to understand that the transcription is going through cuneiform, so it's not going to be exactly what the Egyptians heard, but we have this rough idea of how at least this one sejaminef form sounded. And again, depending on whether you believe that there's one sejaminef or other forms, this particular pronunciation may or may not apply to the other forms. So what does it look like when you're sort of dealing with these hieroglyphic texts and trying to read them? Well, obviously it can be quite complicated and cumbersome, but it's completely achievable. It's not as hard as you might think. With some study, you can definitely get to a point where you can walk into a museum and read words and read phrases and read sentences or large parts of stela, depending on what's there. And so just to show you an example of this, this is the statue that's in the Egyptian gallery at the Oriental Institute. It's always referred to as the King Tut statue, but as you can see from the inscription that's on it, it actually doesn't have King Tut's titulary on it. It has the titulary of Horemheb. So the statue was usurped probably first by Ai and then by Horemheb. That's a larger discussion whether this ever had King Tut's name on it or not, but the name that's on it now is Horemheb, who scratched off the names of the earlier kings who were on it. And what you're looking at here is the inscription from the very front of the lower base. And in our version in the Oriental Institute, this part's actually reconstructed from a companion base that's still in Egypt. And what you can notice here, if we go back to what we were talking about earlier in this sort of little seminar, if we look at the hieroglyphs and which way they're facing, we have two columns, the left two columns that are facing to the right, and the column on the right facing to the left. Now, the reason that this is laid out in this fashion is because you have to think about how this statue would have been set up. It was set up at a mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, facing to the east toward Karnak Temple, the main temple for Amun-Re. And so just as the statue of Horemheb in this case, let's say it's Horemheb for the sake of the inscription, is looking towards the east, towards the temple of Amun, so too does the inscription have the king's titulary facing the reference to the god Amun-Re. So the way that you read this is Nisut Bidi, Jesser Keperu-Re, Setep-in-Re, Zara, Horemheb, Mary and Amun, Di-Ankh Mire Jet, Mary Imen-Ra Neb Nisut Tawi Kinti Ipet Sut. So this is the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Jesser Keperu-Re, or the sacred one of the manifestations of Re, Setep-in-Re, the one whom Re chose, son of Re, Horemheb, beloved of Amun, given life like Re forever. And then on the right side, you start at the bottom. This is the epithet, the participle Mary, beloved of Amun-Re, lord of the thrones of the two lands, foremost in Karnak. And so you can see the inscription is set up like the statue would have been set up, actually the king facing towards the god and the god facing back. And parts of the titulary continue around the sides of the base, where we have a reference to the king as the living Horus, a strong bull who is effective of plans. Again, you see the group for king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands, and then part of the names again, Jesser Keperu-Re, Setep-in-Re, beloved of Amun-Re at the end. So with a little bit of study and work, you can actually learn how to read and interpret these hieroglyphs and go to museums like the Oriental Institute or many of the other museums throughout the world that have Egyptian objects and read this material. So I hope that this was informative and that you can take something away from our lesson today. And if you're interested further in this, I really recommend that you keep an eye on the Oriental Institute social media channels, as other language seminars are recorded and uploaded for you in the coming weeks, focused on other ancient Near Eastern languages that we teach and study here at the Oriental Institute. So, thank you.